Interim Joint Committee on Appropriations and Revenue, meeting 3 in the interim Wednesday, August the 21st, 1 p.m. Eastern, in Annex Room 149. If you will, call the roll, please.
Senator Boswell.
Here.
Senator Deneen.
Here.
Senator Douglas. Senator Funky Fromeyer.
Present.
Senator Givens. Senator Mays Bledsoe. Senator Neal. Senator Nemus.
Present.
Senator Webb. Representative Banta.
Present.
Representative Bentley. Representative Bowling.
Here.
Representative Bray.
Present.
Representative Brown.
Here.
Representative Dietz.
Here.
Representative Dotsett. Representative Flannery.
Here.
Representative Fleming. Representative Fraser Gordon.
Yes.
Representative Freeland.
Present.
Representative Fugate.
Here.
Representative Gentry.
Here.
Representative Hart.
Here.
Representative Johnson.
Here.
Representative McCool. Representative McPherson. Representative Palumbo.
Here.
Representative Raymond.
Here.
Representative Riley. Representative Stevenson. Representative Upchurch.
Here.
Co-Chair McDaniel.
Here.
Co-Chair.
Here. We have a quorum, I believe, and we're duly constituted to conduct a small amount of business, which will be approval of the minutes, and we would entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
So moved by Co-Chair McDaniel. I have a second by Representative Bowling. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Minutes are approved. Any member seeking special recognition before we begin to the substantive matters? Representative Fugate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to address the committee just for a second, if I could. I want to thank you on the House side, Chairman Petrie and Chairman McDaniel on the Senate side, and all of the General Assembly for supporting the ATV trail system we started working on. Really funded it since 2020, and because of that, there's been a lot of work that's went into it. On September 14th, we'll be doing a soft opening, meaning it's just the first step of the trail system. It's in Martin County. I talked to the guys a while ago. It's about 150 miles of trail that'll be opened up. It will eventually connect Martin County to Johnson County, Lawrence County, Floyd County, and then across the river to the Hatfield-McCoy Trail system. And we'd like to invite all of you as members to come out on that Saturday. I know everybody can't come, but if it's all right, I'd like for the staff to pass out just a flyer and a first inaugural permit, just so they can have as a keepsake, if you'd allow that, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Please disseminate to members of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, September the 14th, a good thing to go to. I like side-by-sides, I like four-wheelers, I like motorcycles, I love Jeeps. All those good? Yes, sir. Perfect. Anybody else want to go? Yes, okay.
And I've got a couple empty seats.
We'll
if they
have a
need
crew then, that sounds good. All right, on to the next matter. Thank you for bringing that up. On to the next matter. We have fiscal year 23-24 closeout, and today we have two professional guest speakers, John T. Hicks, State Budget Director, Office of State Budget Director, Greg Harkenreiter, Deputy Executive Director, Governor's Office for Economic Analysis. If y'all will step forward, I know there is a presentation, I believe, on this one. And before we begin, Director Hicks, you're perfectly fine, but Deputy Executive Director Harkenreiter, I have a bone to pick with you publicly. Okay, so have a seat. I understand that you think you're finished with your state service after all these years and are going to be retiring soon. Is that what I heard?
Yes, sir. That's true.
Do you want to rethink that?
I've rethought it a bunch of times, run the numbers every which way I felt.
Very well. Thank you for your years of service. Y'all are both in a business that is detailed and difficult. Thank you for having done all that, and I hope you enjoy retirement, and don't jump back into something too soon. Take a few moments off. Very good. Director Hicks, Deputy Executive Director Harkenrider, y'all proceed. If you will simply state your names for the record, make sure that those green lights are really on green, and if you'll state your names for the record, and I'll swear you under oath.
John Hicks, State Budget Director.
I'm Greg Harkenrider, the deputy up in the budget shop.
Very good. If each of you raise your right hands, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just add to your point. Greg's been with state government for 27 years. In 20 years, he has led the Governor's Office of Economic Analysis, and he was part of the reorganization back in the year 2000 when that element was over in the Finance Administration Cabinet, and State Budget Director Jim Ramsey brought it over into the State Budget Office, and so it's been, which has worked really well. And for those of you who don't know, among the many things that Greg has done, he's the kind of our chief revenue forecaster that not only works with the Consensus Forecast Group, but works with your staff on that. So anyway, he's been a great asset to the Commonwealth for years. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting us. Want to do our fiscal year 24 closeout results, financial results. We talk about the general fund and the road fund. And we've got, as usual, just a lot of numbers to talk about. So go ahead, Greg. I'm going to first talk about the revenue story because that kind of overlays kind of the financial condition of the Commonwealth. We're in an uncommon situation here that I'll talk about earlier. We'll talk about the general fund. I want to talk about the budget reserve fund because of that revenue story, and then talk about the road fund. So first, I like to talk about, even when I was in Washington, D.C., the benefits of biennial budgeting. 20 states have a biennial budget, Kentucky being one of them. We're one of only 3 states, Virginia, Wyoming, and Kentucky, that have already enacted a fiscal 26 budget. The other 17 do it in the odd numbers years. But when you do a biennial budget, sometimes you have 2 cracks at it in terms of the second fiscal year. So fiscal 22 was the second fiscal year enacted, in this case by the 21 session rather than the 20 session, but and then reviewed again in the session you just completed. While you were doing the fiscal 25 and 26, you were re-examining the current fiscal year, or the fiscal 24. Well, this is why, among the reasons. The original enacted revenue estimate for the general fund was $14.15 billion in December of 2019, and then, well, I guess in December of 20, because we did update. And then in the enacted budget, you know, it's now $1.4 billion more. So that was the estimate that this Consensus Forecast Group presented to you and the governor this past December. So that, I mean, that's a significant, I will add, that's on top of the year prior to that, where we were $1.4 billion in revenue surplus over the enacted in fiscal 23 and $945 million in fiscal 22. So this is the third year in which we've had significant increases in revenue over estimates. Nothing unique in Kentucky. This happened across the country, and so it was, good budgeting news, but an unusual situation, and one that you all accommodated, and we'll talk about a little bit in your budgeting process. So the next slide I want to show you is just simply the revised estimate versus the actuals. We came in, that's $16.8 million more than the $15.5 billion estimate. You have to go out a couple of decimal points to get how close that estimate was, 0.11% variance. Well, as Greg would say, the most accurate forecast in aggregate that he's ever done and that the Consensus Forecast Group's ever done. Of course, we had the benefit of new information, but let me talk a couple of things about that. Notice on the actual column, the first 2 lines are individual income and sales and use tax. Those numbers are almost the same. That's new. And part of that is intentional, right? The changes in the individual income tax rates and the real big improvements in sales tax, not only in consumer behavior, but also the expansion to services that have occurred over the years. So that's something that's kind of neat to see for the first time, that those numbers are about equal. And so you can see over on the far right-hand side, you see the difference. Those are really, really small percentage differences, the $29 million off of a $5.8 billion base, and that's that's 0.5%. So you can see how close most of those big numbers were. Down in that other column, a lot of that had to do with interest income that I'll talk about in a little bit in terms of being much greater than we expected. And insurance premiums, if you've looked at your property and casualty premiums for your homes and property in the last couple of years, you've seen what's going on to the valuations, what's going on to the rates, and that's happening. And so real property, insurance premiums are associated with property and casualty have really risen. Next slide, please. So this is the general fund compared to the prior year. I've showed you compared to estimate. Now this is actual 24 compared to actuals 23, and the delta between those 2 years. And you can see down at the bottom is $423 million more than the prior year. $226 million of that came out of the sales tax. We expected the income tax to be slightly negative because of the change in the income tax rates. We went from 5% in fiscal 22 to 4.5% in fiscal 23 and 4% in tax years 24. And so you see a slight decline there. You'll see a bump up in corporate income in LLET, the limited liability entity tax, the major business taxes. Corporate profits have been good, nationwide and in Kentucky, and those have increased. And you see the property tax increase, 24 over 23 was kind of, led by, real property and tangible property, I believe as well. Also, the lottery continues to increase. If you looked at it, and I think Jenny Bannister maybe have done a presentation for you all before, but the lottery continues to produce at an increasing amount. You would think as a person that we would level off with other entertainment venues and opportunities, but so far the lottery has hung in there, despite the entertainment dollar having other opportunities. Next, let me go back one just real quick. What I didn't say was the 2.8% increase, 24 over 23. That's not a surprising number, and it's a fairly historical level. But remember, in fiscal 21, it was 11%. In fiscal 22, it was 14%. And so in fiscal 23 and 24 is more around 3%. That had a combination to do with income tax rates. And as I tell people, when you're going up, when you hear economists talk about slower growth, well, if you're going 100 miles an hour and you slow down to 80, that's slower growth, but you're still going 80. Right? So the level is high, but the rate of change will moderate over time, and it's expected to. So I have to tease economists like Greg and now to quit talking about slower growth as a negative element. It's just something that is expected when you're on the trend that is really going up, and that's what we have been doing on revenues. Next. A couple of highlights here. On the individual income tax, it declined, as I showed you there, by less than a percentage point. Here was the individual income tax. Remember, the tax rate is a tax year or calendar year value, and so we have half of it in the old year and in fiscal year and the other half in the second half of the fiscal year. But this is the change in the reductions. It went down 10%. Then it went down 11%. Now, withholding for the whole fiscal year fell only 6.5%, despite the rate being at 11% reduction. So that shows you that wages and income that are subject to withholding were growing above the rate of the reduction in income tax rate. Individual declarations and net return. So that's when you file and you get a refund. They drop sharply because taxpayer behavior, we're estimating the effect of the individual income tax dropping, right? So declarations drop because your tax liability drops. Pass-through entity tax is a new thing, and you all had a seminar on that last month, but it's a substantial number that over time we expect to be offset, the pluses and the minuses. The timing of that offset is going to be the challenge to economic forecasters. One of the things we were somewhat surprised about was the amount of estimated payments that were being made by pass-through entities, whereas you as an individual taxpayer, you pay estimated payments to avoid late payments and penalties, but as a pass-through entity, you don't have late payments and estimated penalties, but we were getting estimated payments anyway. So we're going to keep an eye on that as we continue through particularly this next fiscal year. On the sales and use tax, after 3 consecutive years of double-digit growth, I thought I had 12%, 11%, 10%, back to back to back. It was only 4%, but on top of that great big level. And going back to that point I made about income tax and sales taxes being equivalent last year, they make up about 3/4 of the general fund, and now they each make up 37% of the general fund. Prior to the change in the tax rate in fiscal, I think 21 to 22, it was 41% individual income tax as a share of the total general fund and 34% sales tax. Now they're both 37%. So you can see the effect of the tax rate reduction and other actions on the sales tax. Next. A couple other highlights. Income from investments. For years, in Kentucky as a state government, we choose to borrow from ourselves for liquidity, right? We get our money in April, right? We spend money all 12 months. So we usually go negative in our cash balance. And so we do internal borrowing rather than revenue anticipation notes in the marketplace. And so as a result, you don't earn any money when you're negative, right? And so our averages for years have been 0 or less. And then in the last 2 fiscal years, look at that, 150 million, 300 million. Well, that's because our average daily balances, because of the buildup of our budget reserve trust fund, last year our average daily balance was $3.7 billion. That's an average over all 12 months. 2.3 billion the year prior. So that's why we've got that money that is unusual and different. But it's a function of the budget reserve trust fund level and the fact that short-term rates are higher now than they've been in the past. Property tax, I mentioned earlier, again, last 2 years have been very good compared to a 4-year average prior to that. And then I mentioned lottery. You can see that the 4-year average prior to the last 2 years is 280 million, now over 330 million, 340 million. So those are some highlights of the revenue stream for fiscal 24. Next. Now this kind of goes back to the consensus forecasting group estimating a $1.4 billion surplus as we walked into the 24 session. Well, you all took that and some other information, and in essence, I've added this up and saying you had $2 billion kind of resulting from these 4 things, most of which was the higher revenue, and you all acted on that. You basically said, put it into the budget reserve trust fund. So that something we've never done before. And because we've never had this situation quite in the time that we did. And so, so you all said you counted on the consensus forecasting group's estimate and some other things that were fairly known and were able to then budget with decent certainty the deposit to the rainy day fund of the budget reserve trust fund. Something I've never seen before in terms of a situation. So great fiscal. And when we talk to the rating agencies, we tell them this story. Look at how it's happened, and then what are we doing with them? And we get superlatives from them on what we've done with our one-time money. Next. So I won't walk through every number here, but I wanted this for your reference. This is kind of the story of the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. 4 consecutive deposits now greater than $1 billion. Here's where we were at the end of fiscal 23, $2.2 billion. Then we put the surplus of fiscal 23 in there. And then we had some uses. You all came back in the 23 session and enacted the Eastern Kentucky Safe Fund after the flooding disasters in Eastern Kentucky. And most of those necessary governmental expense values in there after the $200 million was related to the response to the flooding disaster. It was like $276 million that the emergency management spent in responding. Then the deposit you just made out of the surpluses that you expected, $2 billion, and then you went about appropriating it. And so in House Bill 1 and in Senate Bill 91, just for fiscal 24, $500 million. So there's where the ending balance is, $5.2 billion in the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. So we'll continue the story. Today, I've announced that another $15 million is going into it. Next slide. And that's from the year ending of fiscal 24. You all then, as a part of that use of the Budget Reserve Trust Fund, put another deposit in for the year we just started, fiscal 25, $873 million. The net of those were now at $4.5 million. And then other uses, right? In House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 91, you did Fiscal 24, fiscal 25, fiscal 26. Those are the values of the items that you appropriated out of there. And so if everything works perfectly at the end of this current biennium, we'll have a $3.5 billion budget reserve trust fund, and that's approximately 22% of estimated revenues and about 22% of recurring spending. Those are really high rates. As I like to say, our National Association of State Budget Officers surveys every state every year on their rainy day funds and what they are as a percentage of your budget. And at the end of fiscal 23, we were in the top 10. And half of the other states were oil states, where they have to have large reserves because of the volatility of oil revenues in Alaska and Wyoming and New Mexico and North Dakota. So we've gone over these, few years from almost very little to among the highest in the country. Now, I will say that's a trend that many states are on too, but we've happened to have a very high level, which is, from another positive. When we talk to the rating agencies, they now say, healthy is the word they use. You have healthy reserves. And so they want to make sure they don't put a target for you on there, but they want you to maintain healthy. And so I make sure and talk to them about what healthy can be, right? Healthy doesn't have to be 35%. Healthy can be, more reasonable numbers. And they know that. But I want to set expectations that, like you did in House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 91, you take one-time money and use it for one-time uses way above beyond what we need. Next. So let me shift to the road fund. Before I shift to the road fund, let me announce that later today I will submit a report to this committee that for fiscal year 24, the income tax rate reduction conditions have been met. There are two conditions in the statute. I won't go into the definitions of those, but both of those have been met, and so I'll be communicating that to the co-chairs later today. Moving to the road fund. Similar story in the sense that back in the 22 original budget, the fiscal 24 original budget, $1,679,000,000. The revised estimate was $1,881,000,000, $200 million more in the road fund. You don't see that number in history very often, that big a jump in revenues in the road fund. Because of the way we've dealt with the gas tax, we've had over time a fairly flat road fund revenue total because of the way we deal with the gas tax, but subsequently the combination of motor fuels and motor vehicle usage, which is the sales tax on vehicles, have both been really improved over time. And they're the two biggest pieces of the road fund. So the better those two tax types do, the better the road fund financial situation is. So you can see those differences, again, between the original estimate for fiscal 24 and the updated estimate for fiscal 24. Next, please. Thanks. So again, here's budget to actual. The revised budget, you can see, came in just $7 million under that $200 million increased estimate. So again, a very tiny margin of error. So we like it when CFG and Greg and his folks and John Runker and his folks come to that kind of result. We're very happy with that kind of estimate because it's really difficult to have a point estimate and come that close to it. But you can see even the individual items there are very close in terms of the dollar values associated with the original estimate and the new estimate. And look at the income on investments. Again, those numbers are, again, unique in history for the same reasons I talked about the general fund. The road fund will carry a balance because we set aside money for road projects, and road projects are spent over multiple years. And so we don't have that negative cash balance like we do in the general fund. But even then, making that much money on the road fund is a really positive item. A couple of milestones in the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the comparison of the fiscal year we just ended to the prior fiscal year. So we had an increase of $121 million, 6.9% increase. Look at the percentages on motor fuels. Some of that is tax rate related. There was a tax rate change based upon the statutory formula, right, which averages the average wholesale price over 4 quarters. as a basis. And so those numbers were rising, right? Gas prices at the pump were rising. Average wholesale prices are underneath that were rising. Therefore, the tax rate slightly rise. But motor vehicle usage, we've set, 2 consecutive years of record amounts, Greg?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, those are just plain sales taxes on the purchase of vehicles. And so that's consumer behavior right there, right? So economic times are good enough to where even with high loan rates, right? You know, your car loan rate, if you're buying a new car and you're financing it, still hasn't stopped the value of the purchases. So that's been a real positive for the road fund. Couple of other milestones. I mentioned what happened to the gas tax, slight increase, and you saw 13% growth in the revenues. Again, another 2 straight years of motor vehicle usage tax. And those two things make up 84% of the all road fund revenue. So as they go, so does the road fund. So again, better than originally planned for fiscal 24. We got $200 million more in revenues. Now, on the gas tax, we share nearly half of that with local governments. So that's a use, right? We don't get to go spend it on the biennial highway construction plan. We give it back to the counties and cities. And y'all did a small capital appropriation. But net, we ended up $157 million better than originally budgeted. And what you all did was carried it over into the year we just started. And basically, I'd say put it into highway projects. So again, another good story on that second year of a fiscal biennium. Next. Then at the very end, a very small surplus. That slight change in $7 million, lower than the original $200 million increase. Spending less than budgeted was the basic reason for the official surplus. And in the budget bill in House Bill 6, you all enact a road fund surplus expenditure plan, and about every year it says put it into the biennial highway construction program. And so that's what we've done with that additional $9.8 million. Mr. Chairman, that is all we have today, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Anyone with questions? Senator Boswell?
Well, we got some other things. Thank you for that report. We have some other things to talk about, but I just have a general question. If you think it should be answered by someone else later, you can do that. You can do that later if you want to. So regarding there's these items, I think a lot of these take care of themselves, but on the individual income tax and the sales use tax, could I ask you, who's in charge of auditing these 2 particular areas? And the reason I'm going to have a question and concern I have about these 2 particular categories, individual income tax and sales and use tax, I think both of those should be significantly higher than what they are. So if you can answer that question first, then I will tell you more specifically why I'm concerned.
Sure, Senator Boswell. Thank you. Well, the function is the Department of Revenue's responsibility in terms of auditing, taxpayers' payments, and so that is one of their functions.
So I'm going to tell you what the area of concern that I have. One is that I believe that in this state right now, we have thousands of documented and undocumented workers that are not paying any state income tax. I think there's a lot of businesses that are paying cash. I think probably everybody in this room has knowledge of documented and undocumented workers that are being paid cash and where the state is losing that revenue. And I'm not sure that there's enough auditing going on with various, I can name them, but I don't want us to get into specific businesses. I think we all kind of assume what those are. And then on the sales and use tax, also, I don't know who's auditing, but I have specific evidence of we'll say, of certain businesses that are taxing certain grocery products. And like, for example, water. I know specifically that about 30% of the businesses, if you go buy a bottle of water in a gas station, they charge sales tax. And there's questions about whether water should be taxed. Also, sometimes they're charging taxes, for example, on goods that are not taxable. So my question, I guess, and my concern is, I believe that we're losing a lot of revenue on the individual income tax section, and I believe we're also losing a lot of revenue on the sales tax because I don't think we're being sufficiently audited. I don't think we don't have a sufficient audit process in the state, and I think we need to do something about that.
I appreciate the question. I'm not sure for today's presentation whether you're going to be ready to talk on that or not.
Yes.
That's going to be probably a considerable conversation.
That's right.
But also, fortunately, you also have the Department of Revenue in the room also. They're going to present next. They may not be able to talk with you afterward, offline, or a follow-up entirely. So
Thank you,
good
Mr. Chairman.
question, good topic, and hopefully there can be offline follow-up. Anybody else? One thing I will, thank you again for the presentation, very helpful, very good. I would encourage and caution everyone not to look at this as really, really good or really, really bad. It's just numbers. And those numbers change every day and change in each cycle. But the approach of how we are getting to where we are doesn't just happen because revenues exceed our expectations. It actually has little to do with what's going on here. It has to do with the budgeting itself, and then having that money that's budgeted as what I call a structural surplus at the end of the process. The budget's passed, that goes to the bottom line and goes into reserves, and that's where those deposits are coming from, the bulk is coming from. It's always nice when revenues outstrip estimates, but never count on it.
Yeah. And a parallel to that, Chairman Petrie, is structural balance. You know, structurally, recurring revenues being matched up with recurring expenditures. And I keep mentioning the rating agencies because I've been talking to them lately. That's something that one, we brag on, but two, they ask us about. And I show them, how it is structurally balanced so that, and when they look at things that would improve your rating, right, and things that would hurt your rating, that's always one of those key issues, which is, are you continuing to have structural balance or do you have structural imbalance? So, it's another, again, that's a budgeting intention.
And then right along with that, for the first time, you've been fortunate of having two separate bills to show those credit rating agencies to say this is operational and this is one time, and we're not even letting our eyeballs meet. We're keeping those separate entirely, which is a good point for the credit rating agencies. Anybody else? Thank y'all very much for the presentation. Very good. Next up, we have the Department of Revenue on 2025 potential legislative initiatives. I hope we have with us, I think I see back there, Bethany Atkins-Rice, Richard Dobson, and Gary Morris. If y'all will, make sure your green lights are on when you take a seat. Make sure the microphones are close enough to you. And if you will, introduce yourselves for the record, then I'll place you under oath. Yeah, it's got to be really green and it's got to be really close.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Very good.
We appreciate the opportunity to be here before the committee today. My name is Gary Morris. I'm Executive Director of the Office of Tax Policy and Regulation.
Good afternoon. I'm Bethany Atkins-Rice, Executive Director of the Office of Legal Services for Revenue.
And my name is Richard Dobson. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Sales and Excise Taxes.
Very good. If each of you will raise your right hands, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you
I do.
very much. Please proceed. And there is no presentation of materials of which I'm aware, so everyone's going to need to be attentive and take notes copiously, right?
Yes, sir.
Very good. All right, please proceed.
What we're going to talk about today are some legislative proposals that we brought to the House A&R Chair's attention during the 24 session, and we were privileged to meet with him on February 14th. None of those proposals ended up passing the General Assembly of 2024, and those that we spoke with you about are what we're here to speak with you about today. There's maybe a few minor tweaks to what we're proposing, but it's the same items, and we're prepared to go through those and just briefly describe them. the philosophy on what we are proposing in these proposals is clarifying existing provisions, technical changes, and to provide clearer reporting requirements for taxpayers and taxpayer equity in a policy change. And I'm just going to go right through those.
Very good.
The first thing is we're proposing an income tax deduction for medical or medicinal cannabis businesses to make them similar to what has been done in a few other states. As you all know, or many of you all know, the Kentucky income tax law follows the Internal Revenue Code for the calculation of income and deductions. That's what determines what goes on our tax returns that taxpayers fill out. Cannabis businesses are not allowed under the Internal Revenue Code to deduct their ordinary business expenses like other businesses. What we're proposing here is to allow them to deduct their business expenses on their Kentucky return.
Was there any indication of what the physical impact would be on that potential?
No, sir, I do not have a number to give you on that.
Perfectly fine, just asking. Thanks.
The next item is to clarify the minimum thresholds for being required to be subject to the sales tax. And I'm going to let Richard Dobson, our expert in that area, explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, this threshold has to do with our economic nexus threshold, and back in 2018, the General Assembly had the foresight to adopt a change in our legislation regarding nexus, and this was before the Wayfair decision in June of 2018. But many states, and the streamlined states particularly, were kind of paving the way, pioneering this economic nexus concept that not only would you, a remote vendor, have to collect a state's tax, sales and use tax, if there was physical presence, but if there was an economic presence. And there's two thresholds under that economic nexus. There's 100,000 in gross receipts, or 200 or more transactions. And what we're recommending here is to eliminate the 200 transaction threshold. And since 2018, with a review of the types of remote vendors that have registered, in many of the other streamlined states, 7 of those that adopted that originally have removed that 200 transaction threshold. And the reason for that is that we get the targeted audience, we get the businesses with substantial economic nexus just with the 100,000 in gross receipts, and we end up potentially getting a business that's very small that may sell 200 items. For example, you're selling mechanical pencils or some type of memorabilia that the dollar amount's very small, but the number might be great, and it's more trouble than it's worth, and we're imposing a burden on these businesses that are not located in Kentucky. And so, as I said, 7 other streamlined states have removed that, and there really isn't any kind of an economic impact. It's more taxpayer friendly. And one other item in this proposal also deals with the nexus provisions within our statutes to ensure that we are calculating the economic nexus presence. As we have expanded our sales tax base, this change would make it clear that our 100,000 in gross receipts doesn't just count the sales of tangible property, but also counts and makes it clarify that indeed it counts the sales of these various services. And in many of the services that we've expanded, based upon the way we source things, the service can actually be performed out of state, but the recipient is in Kentucky, and so it's sourced to Kentucky and subject to sales and use tax here. So we want to clarify that. That's just a technical change, but it really it plugs a potential loophole down the road if we don't change that.
The next item I'm going to talk about, and that relates to income tax estimated payments and requests for refunds from taxpayers on that. What we're attempting to do is provide the capability for us to refund that money sooner than after they file their tax returns that are due on April 15th. Some taxpayers mistakenly pay us via the estimated payment process with money they intended to send to the United States Treasury for their federal estimated payments, and also they send incorrect amounts, including in electronic payments. And right now, we have to inform those taxpayers, we'll give you a refund, but the law tells us you have to file a return to get that refund. And we want to be able to expedite the refund process when it's clearly and easily identified by us that the money is due back, and then we can issue the refund well in advance of April 15th the following year. So that we would label that a taxpayer-friendly proposal for those that have that circumstance. The next item is related to the electric vehicle charging tax, and Mr. Dobson is going to explain that.
Well, this is a new tax, the EV excise power tax, and in implementing this, we found where, in many cases, the parties that actually operate the charging stations and actually receive payment from the users, they're better able to register and collect than have necessarily the actual owner or the lessee. So this is a change to make it more, make it easier to comply and have folks that are registering and remitting the tax that actually collect the funds and the payments for using the charging stations. So this would be a change to help us from a registration standpoint, and to ensure that the party that collects the funds is actually the party that would be remitting the funds as well.
The next proposal is to apply a sales tax resale exemption to the sale of admissions, and Richard will again explain.
You can count how many services does Kentucky impose a sales and use tax on now, and it's at least 49 services, and there are subcategories of those. But we have a broad base of services in the state now. Every one of those services has a resale provision except for admissions. Admissions was one of the original services that tax was imposed upon, and it's been changed from time to time as far as the definition of admissions. But this is an area where it has created situations where a lot of times people claim double taxation, and that's in the eye of the beholder. But in this case, you can have a situation where we've used it in the tourism, for example. Parties coming in and purchasing packages. They may have a tour bus, and they pay for the tour, and then as they are in the state, they may be going to various venues, and if the touring company pays for the original admissions, it's subject to sales tax. They can't say, well, this tour bus company, I'm buying these admissions to resell to my customers. They can't claim a resale. They have to pay the sales tax, and then when that touring company bills their customers, then sales taxes on that as well. That's just one example of where there is a tax on both of those transactions, whereas in all other services, if it is we're talking about that exact service being purchased and directly resold to another party, then it's not subject to tax at the initial purchase, but it would be when it's sold to the final consumer. That's the change that we would be proposing. Let me keep going here.
The next one is to provide a sales tax exclusion for extended warranty service contracts for small utilities and commercial mobile radio service, that's 911 providers.
So back in 2019, the legislature created an exclusion on extended warranty services for these were smaller telephone utilities and CMRS providers. And then that was in 2019. In 2023, the definition of extended warranty services was changed, and initially it included tangible property. Now it also includes a warranty or maintenance service on pre-written computer software access services. So there's some services that are now subject to sales tax, but since these small telephone providers were excluded from paying tax on extended warranty services, when the extended warranty is on tangible property, this recommendation is just to in similar fashion, give them an exclusion on extended warranty services if it applies to the pre-written computer software access services. So it's a technical change, but this would be a proposal that's consistent with what the General Assembly did in 2019. It's just one of those things that we didn't catch or probably was inadvertent. So that's a technical change, but it would also be taxpayer friendly to that group of providers that are granted an exemption.
The next one is a two-part excise tax cleanup proposal, clarification proposal. First part is to require the reporting of alcohol that is blended with gasoline upon its first import into Kentucky, because once alcohol is blended with gasoline to make gasohol, I think is the term that's used, that the whole product is taxable under the gasoline tax. The second part of this relates to tobacco products taxes, and we're wanting to require that the operators of other tobacco products and vaping product vending machines be required to be licensed the same manner that cigarette vending machine operators are required to be licensed under the present law, to put those people under equal footing with cigarettes.
Yeah, just to add to that, you don't think of cigarettes and vending machines, but there are still vending machines for cigarettes. But now we've seen vending machines for vaping products, for example, and so we're trying to again treat them in a similar fashion, and licensing these will give us a better ability to track and ensure the right amount of tax is paid. Along the line on the tobacco excise tax, we've had a situation with the tobacco products and especially vaping products where we have some out-of-state, we call them distributors, but technically our definition of distributor only applies to a party that is located in the state. And we're trying to enforce compliance on a business that is selling vaping products to consumers, for example, in Kentucky. And they're pointing out, well, you can't call us a distributor because we're not in the state. And so we'd like to tweak that. We're still trying to enforce it as it currently reads, but there are some legal challenges to that. So this, again, just closes a loophole and ensures we're treating our out-of-state businesses that are making sales into Kentucky, that they're treated in the same way that our resident businesses are treated. And then, of course, Gary just explained on the motor fuel side. This is more a tracking, again, for it would be the product that's fuel-grade ethanol, that we can track that, ensure that it's also properly reported and the tax is paid.
The last item on our list for today is under the inheritance tax. This is a proposed small policy change, but for decades there has been a funeral expense deduction allowed on the return of $5,000, and in recognition of how much more funerals cost in the present day, we're proposing to increase that deduction to $12,000.
Do we have an idea of what the fiscal impact would be on that?
No, sir, I do not. We will be glad to work on that, and if we can determine the number, we'll get back to you.
yeah, that'd be a little bit of a challenge, but we'll look and see what we can do. There is one other item here in regard to it's a motor fuels tax refund situation for taxi cab companies, and we're proposing to eliminate that exemption. It's really a partial exemption. They're only able to get 7/9 of the amount of motor fuels tax they pay. But I asked, we're looking at how many claims we've had over the years. And last year, we only had 3 companies file for the refund, and it was less than $20,000. So this is one of those things that cost more for us to administer than actually that it generates, even for the benefits of the businesses. And in most cases, the companies aren't even trying to claim the exemption. And if you recall, we also expanded a new excise tax on motor vehicle rentals and ride share. And so a comparable business like the taxi cab companies, they don't have this exemption. So it would be our recommendation from an equity standpoint, and also the fact that it's not really being claimed, to eliminate that.
Does that cover your items for today?
It does.
Very good. Thank you. Gotcha. And yeah, I think we did speak in February, and we've spoken semi-regular basis. So I've tried to caution everybody when we get into session, things get tight. So we try to work on those things before we get into session so we can vet them y'all's end, but vet them from our end, make sure we're digesting them correctly. So hopefully this will serve to get us into 25 if things are appropriately timed for that. If not, then we well in advance for 26. And if there's anything new that pops up that you think may be relevant for this upcoming session, before November 1, November 15 would be a great time to get that over to us so we could even give it due consideration for the upcoming. Senator McDaniel?
Richard, I'm going to ask you to go back a ways in there. I missed some details on one. On the sourcing nexus inside of the mandatory returns.
Yes,
Could
sir.
you kind of just recap that for me again, please?
On the sourcing, you're talking about when I was dealing with the economic nexus threshold and ensuring that these services that are now part of the subject to sales tax are included in the 100,000 in gross receipts. Is that the point you were?
I think so, and you were also talking about something being sourced in or out of the state.
Okay. Well, just in general, our sourcing provisions for sales tax, it's when is a transaction sourced to Kentucky, and is it subject to sales tax in Kentucky? And so for services, the criteria we use, it's based upon where the services are received. So the party that is the customer, where do those who is paying for those services and who's receiving those services. So in many cases, the service itself could be performed out of state by the provider, but if that provider is performing that service wherever, and the party receiving it is a Kentucky customer, then it's subject to Kentucky tax. So that's what I think that's what I was commenting on earlier.
Very good. I'm sorry, I got a little twisted as I was listening. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Senator Funk-Fromeyer?
Yes, thank you. There was some question about the electric vehicle tax versus hybrid vehicles. And I'm not sure of the execution of that tax and the implementation of it. I've had a number of constituents reach out and look at inconsistency of a fully electric vehicle versus a hybrid vehicle.
First off, I think just to make sure we're clear, there was an EV charging tax. It's on the charging activity itself is what you were presenting on. And then I can talk to you about that offline, but really where it started at was House Bill 8 in 2022 that had a 1 or 2 year delay that was really focused on the first draft that went out, and from there on about battery reclamation, which would cover hybrids as well as pure plug-in EVs. That was repealed this last session on the hybrid session, so it's only on the EVs that are pluggable at this point. And I can talk with you in more detail, but I just want to hit that without going over the top of it, just give you a little bit, and we can talk about it afterwards if you want more detail. But they were talking about the charging activity itself, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Senator Boswell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the legislature passed a law that exempted gold and bullion from taxation. But it's my understanding, I'm getting a lot of emails and letters from people saying that the governor or the Department of Revenue is not allowing that exemption, which we put into laws. Could you bring us up to date on what's going on with the gold tax exemption?
That may bring in Ms. Rice, I figure.
I can speak to that. Our position is that Governor Beshear lawfully exercised his power to disapprove any part or parts of an appropriation bill. And so therefore, the exemption, we are not implementing the exemption.
Okay, well, I think you answered my question. I think I just want to make it clear to us that the governor's ignored the intent of the legislature to exempt this, and I think probably the only way we're going to be able to solve it is just to pass a law. So, and you did mention, if I may, just one other thing.
Yes, please.
So you did mention a double taxation situation, and I think last month I'm the chairman of a budget review committee on economic development, and we had an issue come before us regarding a rental manufacturing company, and in that presentation, I think we made it clear that they are a manufacturing company, and one of the only state in the United States that taxes a company that has rental uniforms that are manufactured by them and being subject to double taxation. And this has come up, I know, before the Department of Revenue. It's been talked about, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, or that may be a similar situation where in order to solve this problem, we may have to pass some legislation.
Senator Boswell, that we are familiar with the issue. We wouldn't characterize it as a double taxation quite like the resale with admissions, but it would be correct that we believe this requires a legislative action to address.
Thank you.
Representative Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brief question. Going way back to our first part of your presentation, the topic of medical cannabis, I think I'm not sure I understood exactly what your recommendation was there. Were you recommending a sales tax increase on medical cannabis to align with other states? Because I don't think I got that right.
Representative Johnson, no, sir, we're not. It was an income tax deduction issue that we were proposing. We were proposing to allow them to deduct their business expenses on their income tax return the same as other businesses do.
Okay, but there wasn't anything about an increase of taxes?
No, sir.
Was there? Okay, thank you. Appreciate clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I understood that right, there's nothing to do with sales tax on that issue of medical cannabis. This is all about expensing from a business standpoint.
Yes, sir.
Okay. That's what the issue is. All right. Anyone else? Representative McPherson?
So going back to your 18 law about people bringing in, selling outside the state for $100,000 or greater. So the vaping products that you're saying we're bringing into the state from outside vendors, would they not be caught up in that? Would they not go in the threshold of the $100,000 or the 200 units?
That's a good question. The threshold that I'm referring to is under Chapter 139, that it applies only to sales and use taxes, and it doesn't apply to other thresholds. And when you're dealing with vaping products, even tobacco products, these are highly regulated and would come under, those regulations that require enforcement, even with alcohol, for example. Direct shipment of alcohol, there are requirements for registration and payment that are outside Chapter 139 that enforce a compliance to various state tax laws. It's just not unique to Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Gibbons?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I actually only had one question, but now it's grown into two. And the first question I have is in response, Mrs. Rice, to your response earlier to the senator's question about the gold bullion taxation. I want you to elaborate just a little bit again, and I think you're aware of some question about whether the measure was an appropriations measure or whether it was a revenue-raising measure. And if you could also elaborate on that for the sake of the committee, because I disagree respectfully with the position you've taken.
Yes, Senator Givens.
Make sure your mic is on, please. Thank you.
Yes, Senator Givens. We have looked at this, myself and my legal staff, and we have agreed and taken the position that he lawfully exercised his veto right. I mean, I think the question is whether House Bill 8 is an appropriations bill, as that term is used under Kentucky Constitution Section 88. You know, it's at the top, it says it's an act relating to fiscal matters, making an appropriation therefore, and declaring an emergency. A review of House Bill 8 reveals a primary purpose of expending public funds. I mean, arguably, it's not a revenue-raising bill because almost all the provisions are tax expenditures. And so when we looked at that, we agree that it is an appropriations bill, but do recognize that there is a question on both sides.
Thank you for your acknowledgement of the fact that there is a question. And to clarify, the governor used, and it's not just this governor, this is long been a matter of contention between the legislative branch and the executive branch. This has nothing to do with who's sitting in the governor's office today, in my opinion. But the use of a line item veto in a piece of legislation that many view to be a revenue-raising measure creates some consternation. And I think you can understand our position on that. So I simply wanted to reflect for the record and the members in the room that this is not a decided matter with regard to the way some of us view the question. Thank you for acknowledging that as well. Now, briefly, Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up with a different line of questioning, and I am
On the same topic or different topic?
on a different topic.
If I may, very quickly.
Please.
I think I understand what you're saying as far as it also dealt with tax expenditures as a raising of revenue. And I would just make sure that we're clear when we read that Constitution from some years ago, as we may think raising today is an increase. Raising at that point is not necessarily an increase. We have to understand the context within which it is said, whether it's an up or a down, and a tax expenditure is definitely a down for revenues. So it has the same function of affecting revenues, whether it be in the direction of increase or decrease. I think that's what the pertinent point is from a legal standpoint. However, reasonable minds can disagree. I understand that. But I'd also, you said we agree, but I assume that you disagree with the Attorney General's opinion that came out on the matter. Where I think you can look that up. Anyone in the public can look it up and get a history of bill passed, purported veto, no override because it was purported. I'm just relating one side to the Secretary of State as if no veto, and then Attorney General reviews it and says it's appropriate. It is what it's supposed to be, and I think it has been adopted into the statutes at this point. So the Department of Revenue would be taking a position contrary to face prima facie statute at this point. It may still take a lawsuit to resolve it, but I'm just making sure that piece of information in the context is out there also. Thank you very much, and please proceed. Next topic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My second topic is one that we've been seeking some information on, and it's fortuitous, Mr. Morris, that you're here at the table. We've had a couple of communications with your staff in the Department of Revenue around tax increment financing agreements. And we still seem not to have gotten a response to our initial December request for information, and then a letter that's dated July the 31st of this year. Could you share with us, are there some challenges to providing us information, or do you need another copy of the letter as it relates to tax increment financing agreements as we try to make policy decisions in that regard?
Thank you, Senator Givens. We are aware of that request, and we do apologize. We are working on providing that information to you. It's just in the process of being gathered and provided to you.
Very good. Could you approximate, and I'm not trying to be contentious at all, could you approximate a date by which we'll have the information?
Well, we hope within the next week or so.
Within the next week or so. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. On that issue, if you don't mind, when we come back before committee this next month, if you can supply that to the co-chairs, just that it's been responded, or whether there's more information to follow up with, just so we can track the status of it.
Okay, will do.
Thank you very much. Any other members seeking recognition for a question or comment? Seeing none, thank y'all very much for the presentation and for answering questions within and without presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the committee.
Next up for consideration, we have 2024 Annual Economic Report by the eminent Michael Clark, PhD, Director of Center for Business and Economic Research, who struggled mightily to get here today, and I appreciate that. And if you will, make sure your microphone is on, close enough to you. Introduce yourself by name, then I'll place you under oath.
Good afternoon.
He's got it.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Mike Clark. I'm the director for the Center for Business and Economic Research at UK.
Very good.
And if you give me just a moment, I'll get my slide. I'm sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead and get the slides up.
All right, I'm good.
Very good. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please proceed.
All right. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here again today. Again, we're the Center for Business and Economic Research within the Gatton College of Business and Economics at UK. And one of the things that we do each year is we produce the Kentucky Economic Annual Report. Our report basically it provides an extensive coverage of the state economy across a number of different metrics. If you haven't received a copy, I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's over 300 pages. It takes a very in-depth look at various aspects of Kentucky's economy, how we're trending, how we compare to other states. The annual report is required by statute. We produce this every year around February, and each of you should have received a copy at that time. In addition to covering specific topics related to the economy, we also cover some occasional topics, such as how artificial intelligence affects the economy, how the housing market is progressing, and we also include our economic outlook for Kentucky for the coming year. Today, I'm going to talk about how the economy has been performing over the past year. But before I do that, I want to talk about what our expectations were as we were going into 2024. Now, in the previous 2 years, you remember the situation that we were experiencing was particularly high rates of inflation that was prompting the Federal Reserve to increase interest rates in an attempt to slow down demand for goods and services. As we increase the interest rates, it makes it more expensive for consumers to finance their consumption through debt, whether it be mortgages, car loans, or financing debt through credit cards. Higher interest rates slows that down, and in theory, that should bring inflation down. Now, we're also expecting that as a result of these higher interest rates, we would see lower inflation, but we'd also see slower economic growth. But as we were going into 2024, the economy was looking very strong, and so the risk of a recession seemed very, very low. In fact, it was looking very much like, and continues to look like, the Federal Reserve might be able to achieve this soft landing that we often hear about. Our expectation was, given this context, that the Federal Reserve would start looking at reducing interest rates in the last half of 2024 as they started seeing the effects of their monetary policy show up in terms of the inflation numbers and the other economic indicators. For Kentucky, our expectation was that this would also translate to slower employment growth for the state, and that we might possibly see a contraction in terms of manufacturing employment. Kentucky had actually done very well in terms of our manufacturing employment in the previous 2 years, and we were starting to hear some indications from the manufacturing sector that they were starting to see reductions in orders, and so we were concerned that we might see a bit of a contraction in terms of manufacturing employment. So how is the economy progressing so far? Well, as we're in 7 months already, roughly the economy seems to be proceeding as we expected. We are seeing employment growth slow. The economy, various measures of the economy is slowing, and we are also seeing inflation rates are coming in. However, there was a July employment report that came out that I think spooked a lot of the markets, a lot of investors all over the place. The July employment numbers basically came in at the national level slower than many had expected. There was still an increase in employment. It was just not increasing as fast as many had expected. For Kentucky, July employment had actually declined from June to July, and so I think there were maybe some additional concerns there. We're also seeing unemployment rates rise, but particularly here in Kentucky, we're not so much seeing unemployment rates rise because people are losing jobs. We're seeing it, as I'm going to show in a few minutes, because people seem to be coming into the labor force at this point. So we start getting into the various measures of how the economy is performing. Let's talk about inflation, because last year that was the big issue. How is inflation progressing? Well, remember, inflation is the rate at which prices are growing. And we talk about prices, we talk about this large basket of goods and services. So think about all the things you put into your grocery cart. Now add into that the cost of your car, the cost of your mortgage, your rent, your homeowner's insurance, your motor vehicle insurance, all the things that households spend their money on. We want to think about how those prices together are changing. And we measure that in a couple of different ways. What I'm showing here is what we call the CPI, Consumer Price Index, for measuring inflation. It's commonly reported in the news, and so it's seen quite a bit. You can see that in 2022, inflation rates were extremely high. If we look at all the items that go into that basket, it had gotten as high as 9%. We have made significant progress in terms of getting those inflation rates down. As of July, the year-over-year inflation rate was 2.9%. We oftentimes exclude food and energy because prices for food and energy tend to be very volatile and are not necessarily always related to how the economy is doing overall, because they have unique market issues associated with them. So oftentimes we exclude that to get maybe a better measure of how inflation is going for the rest of the economy. That also has declined substantially. We're down to about 3.2%. Now, ideally, what the Fed is trying to do is get inflation down to about 2% per year, so that it's a relatively low and relatively stable inflation rate that we can kind of anticipate. Now, when inflation is coming down for all goods and services, I want to talk about a few different areas that I think are of particular note. So these are just different parts of the basket that we consume. So we think about food consumed at home, or our groceries. During the pandemic, or coming out of the pandemic in 2022, we started seeing the price of food consumed at home, the price of groceries increase quite a bit, well over 10%. Inflation on groceries has really come in. July 2024 compared to July 2023, prices had only increased by 1.1%. Food consumed away from home or at our restaurants has come down as well, not nearly as much. Year-over-year growth in prices of about 4%. We do have a few issues, though, in terms of some other areas where we're still seeing some somewhat persistent inflation. Shelter, so think about your cost to rent an apartment. That's still up around 5%. And if we look at transportation services prices still increased year over year at about 8.8%. Now, with transportation services, we might look at that and think, okay, well, that must be referring to the cost of a car or the cost of gas. Those are actually counted somewhere else. Price of cars has actually been coming down a bit. Inflation rates for cars, the price of a new car and a used car has slowed, and in fact, last month was actually down. Transportation services is referring to airfare, the cost to repair your automobile, and the other big category is the cost to insure your car. As prices for automobiles increased over the last couple of years, that's increasing the cost for insurance companies to provide insurance coverage, and so premiums are increasing as well. So generally, inflation seems to be coming down towards the Fed's target of about 2%, but we do have some areas where we're still seeing some inflation. Another large measure of the economy, or common measure of the economy, is gross domestic product, or GDP. With GDP, what we're referring to is the dollar value of the goods and services that are produced in an area. GDP is measured both at the state level and the U.S. level. And here what I'm showing you is kind of how those have trends for both the U.S. and Kentucky. And you can see that we tend to move right along with the national economy. There are some things about our economy that are very unique. We're different in many ways, but we are highly integrated into the U.S. economy. So as the U.S. economy does well, we grow as well. When the U.S. economy starts to decline, we tend to follow right along with it. Looking at change in gross GDP, looking at the quarter-to-quarter change in GDP, excuse me just a moment. Okay, let's try this again. Looking at the quarterly change in GDP, we only have this available for the first quarter of Kentucky. And you can see that both for Kentucky and the nation, growth in GDP had slowed down just a bit. That bounced back at the national level during the second quarter to about 2.8%. So GDP suggests that we're growing right now. Given that the U.S. has increased, I would anticipate that Kentucky's GDP has probably increased as well, but we're still waiting on those numbers. I'll talk for several minutes about labor market indicators. One of the most common labor market indicators we see is the unemployment rate. And if you've been to my presentations before, you'll remember that the unemployment rate is one of my least favorite economic indicators. It's not that it's a bad statistic, it's often a misinterpreted statistic. We really need more information than just the unemployment rate to understand what is going on with this. Now, again, our unemployment rate tends to move very much along with the national unemployment rate. Generally, we tend to have a higher unemployment rate than we see nationally. But when we look at the unemployment rate, one of the things that we should note is, first, last year, I believe it was, we set a record low in terms of the unemployment rate. We have seen that come up. It's come up to about 4.7%. That is an increase over where we were last year, but it is still historically a very low unemployment rate. What's behind this increase in the unemployment rate? What is it indicating? Is it indicating that we have people losing their jobs? What's going on? So to really understand what's going on with the unemployment rate, we have to understand how it's actually constructed. We survey people. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys people about their employment situation. And based on the answers to those questions, they are grouped into three different categories. The first is, if you're working for pay, you're considered to be employed. If you're not working for pay, but you are searching for a job in the last 4 months, or 4 weeks, as you're going to interviews, you're applying for a job, you are considered unemployed. If, however, you don't have a job and you're not looking for work, you're not counted as being unemployed if you're not looking for work. So in that case, you're considered as being not in the labor force. Now, this not in the labor force group, that consists of a lot of people in a lot of different situations. This can be somebody who's a full-time student. This could be somebody who's retired. This could be somebody who's taking care of their family. This could also be workers who maybe were unemployed for a long period of time, and stopped looking for work. Once they stop looking for work, even though they might want a job or need a job, if they're not actively searching for work, they're not counted in the official unemployment numbers. Because the unemployment rate looks at the number of people who are unemployed divided by how many people are working or searching for a job. So we really got to get into what is going on behind these numbers. So what I'm going to show you now is the change in the number of people who are unemployed from 1 month to the next. Now you can see here that, from 2023 on through the first 7 months of 2024, we've been seeing an increase in the number of people indicating that they are without a job and are looking for a job. So we are seeing more people indicating that they are unemployed, that is, they're looking for work. If you look at the number of people who are employed, that is, they actually have a job for pay, in 2023, we were seeing this number decline. But in 2024, we've actually been seeing more and more people indicating that they are working. The number of people working in Kentucky in July was higher than it was a year ago. So we're seeing more people indicating that they are working. So the unemployment rate is going up, but it's not so much because people are losing their jobs. We're actually seeing more people are actually working. So what's going on with this? Well, we're seeing people coming back into the labor force. If you talked with me a year ago, you would have heard me expressing some concern about our labor force participation rate. Here I'm showing you both Kentucky and the U.S. labor force participation rate. And you'll notice that Kentucky's labor force participation rate tends to be quite a bit lower than the national numbers. As we were coming out of the pandemic, we started seeing people coming back into the labor force. But then that turned in 2022. We started seeing our labor force participation rate gradually declining for quite a while. While at the same time, nationally, we were seeing labor force participation rate was going up. Well, that turned in 2024. We started seeing people coming back into the labor force in Kentucky. And so our numbers have actually improved quite a bit. If you look at the monthly change in labor force for the nation, you see that, it bounces around quite a bit, but it's generally, kind of this gradual upward trend. For Kentucky, you can see in 2023 that it was declining, but in 2024, it has been steadily increasing. So what we're seeing in terms of the unemployment rate is actually because we see people coming into the labor force as opposed to people losing jobs. This is also showing up in terms of our unemployment insurance claims. Now, we calculate the unemployment rate. It really is not related to who is getting unemployment insurance. It's about whether or not you have a job, that is, you don't have a job, and you're looking for work. And you may be getting unemployment insurance, or you may not be getting unemployment insurance, depending on your situation. But unemployment insurance claims give us an indication of how many people are separating involuntarily from their employer. And you can see from these weekly numbers that initial claims for UI have actually been trending down for some time. And if you looked out and actually looked at pre-pandemic numbers, what you'll see is that our numbers are very low in a historical context. Now you'll note here a couple weeks ago, there was a bit of a bump in terms of our initial claims. That occurred during the first couple weeks in July. That occurs every year in the first couple weeks in July because in our automobile manufacturing sector, we have a lot of factories that will shut down for a couple of weeks. The workers will separate from their jobs briefly, but then they come back. And so those numbers, those initial claims fell in the subsequent weeks. So again, what these numbers are telling us is that we are not seeing right now people being so much dismissed from their jobs. Some of that occurs, but we're not seeing an upward tick in that. Okay, I'm going to change from talking about the number of people working to a slightly different measure of employment. Here we're talking about jobs. In the previous numbers, we're surveying households, asking them who's working. Now what we're doing is we're talking about numbers that are coming from surveys of employers, where we're asking how many people do you have on your payroll? And keep in mind, an individual can work multiple jobs, so it's a slightly different measure of employment. Here what I'm showing you is basically the distribution of where our jobs are for non-farm employment. And you see this compared to our surrounding states and to the United States as a whole. And you can see there's a lot of similarities. Large categories in, such as trade, transportation, utilities tend to be large in Kentucky and in the U.S. as well. We're a little bit heavier in terms of our trade, transportation, utilities in the nation as a whole. We're also heavier in terms of our manufacturing. Manufacturing accounts for about 12.6% of the jobs in Kentucky compared to 8.8% of the jobs in the U.S. You can also see where maybe we're a little bit light relative to the U.S. In terms of professional business services and financial activities, those sectors account for a smaller share of our non-farm employment here in Kentucky than across the U.S. as a whole. All right, so let's take a look at the trends. Here we see U.S. total non-farm employment. It's, again, been trending up. We've basically recouped the job losses from the pandemic. And if you look at the month-to-month changes, what you start to see is that each month we are reporting an increase in the number of jobs. But the increase that we're seeing from month to month generally tends to be slowing. We were adding jobs at a very good clip in 2023. That has slowed a bit in terms of 2024. If we look at Kentucky, again, we see that we recovered all those jobs and we are actually well above where we were if we would have just kind of maintained that trend prior to the pandemic. And I also want to kind of focus on these last few months. How have the monthly change in jobs been progressing? Well, again, you can see over the last year and a half, basically, we have been adding jobs. July stands out. In July, from June to July, we saw a decline in employment of about 5,600. That's 5,600 fewer jobs than what we had the previous month. Now, that in and of itself doesn't cause me a great deal of concern because if you look at this chart, you see sometimes we have months where there's a decline, even though the general trend is an upward trend. You see, 2 months in 2023, for example, where there's a decline followed by increases. General trend has been positive. So 1 month by itself doesn't cause me to be concerned. What we're looking for is month to month, do we see kind of a recurring theme here? The other thing I want to do is kind of focus on what happened with this month. Why did it go down, or where did it go down? So here what I'm showing you is of those 5,600 jobs that were lost, what sector did they occur in? And you see two sectors that really jump out. The first is government, where we saw 2,800 fewer jobs. The second is manufacturing, where we saw 1,800 fewer jobs. Again, this is from June to July. Well, manufacturing, we kind of expected that there might be a bit of a decline in terms of manufacturing employment. So again, not terribly surprising there. The government employment, the 2,800, if we dig into that, where we see where that's occurring is in terms of our local government. Local government includes our teachers. Well, in July, what was happening with teachers? Well, schools were out of session. Now, these numbers are seasonally adjusted, but there's been some odd seasonal patterns here over the last few years. So I think what's really going on is this decline that we're seeing in terms of 2,800 is really some seasonality that we still have running around in our estimates that hasn't been fully addressed. And we've actually seen this in the previous 2 years, where in July, those numbers would come down. And then in August, when the schools start back up, those numbers come back up. So right now, I'm looking at July as kind of an odd month, but not a whole lot really going on in terms of telling us what's going on with trends. Okay, so that's 1 month to the next month. I want to pull back and look at a little bit longer time frame. Here we're looking at July 2023 to July 2024 to show you over the past year how have these sectors improved. Kind of the same story. Manufacturing, we're seeing a bit of a decline. We're also seeing a decline in terms of information, financial activities, and professional and business services. Where we're seeing growth is in terms of our our education health services. That sector added 15,200 jobs over the past year. Most of this is in the healthcare sector. We can also compare how we're doing on a percentage basis to the U.S. to get an idea of which of our sectors maybe are not keeping up with the U.S. and which are outperforming the U.S. In terms of sectors where we're not keeping up with U.S., manufacturing over the last 12 months, we've not kept up with. But keep in mind, the past 2 years, we actually did really well in terms of our manufacturing. I'll show you a little bit more about that here in just a minute. We're also not keeping up in terms of our information sector, but keep in mind, I think a lot of people, that information sector suggests that should be IT. IT is not part of that. This is more like radio, TV, newspapers, providing information. It's actually a relatively small sector. Where we're doing really well over the past year compared to the U.S. is, again, our construction and our education health services sector. We've outperformed the nation over the past year in those sectors. Okay, I want to pull back even farther and show you what's kind of going on in terms of long-term trends. So here I'm showing you total non-farm employment. And so I can show you Kentucky relative to our surrounding states and the U.S. as a whole. I'm showing this as a percent change. Every month here is basically benchmarked to where were we January 2013. Now keep in mind, during certain periods on this graph and some subsequent graphs, you're going to see there's going to be periods maybe 2016 through 2019 where maybe we were trending a bit differently than what we are now. So kind of keep that in context as we are looking through this. But what you see is that, particularly if you look at the last few years, we seem to have done really well relative to the U.S. in terms of our employment growth. Okay, don't strain your eyes. I'm going to zoom in on a couple of these. I understand this is small, but I'm going to show you similar graphs for some individual sectors. Now, we can look at all these if you want to, but I'm only going to focus on maybe 2 or 3 that I think are worth your interest. The first I want to focus on is the manufacturing sector. I've been talking about that quite a bit. But you can see our manufacturing sector, when we came out of the coming out of the pandemic, we were doing really well relative to our surrounding states and the U.S. We had a strong manufacturing sector that came back strong. We even saw employment exceed what we were doing prior to the pandemic. And if you look at those years prior to the pandemic, it was generally mostly flat, a very slight upward trend. So we've done really well there. We have fallen back a little bit in terms of our manufacturing employment here over the last year. The other sector that I want to focus on is what we're seeing in terms of construction. Now, during different time periods, our construction employment has been relatively slow. For example, relative to the U.S., or excuse me, relative to our surrounding states, from 2016 to 2020, employment in the construction sector was not growing nearly as fast. Over the last few years, though, what we've seen is that our construction employment has really taken off and has really narrowed that gap in terms of where we were relative to our surroundings, relative to the U.S. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this next slide. Basically, it's just more data saying, we seem to be seeing job growth here, just kind of reinforcing that. Now, we have experienced some good job growth over the last couple of years. We've all heard about the tight labor market that caused wages to increase over the last couple of years. Here, what I'm showing you is this data is available for the U.S. This particular data is not available for Kentucky, but we likely are experiencing very similar trends. So here what we're looking at is private wages and salaries and how they have compared from one year to the next. As we were coming out of the pandemic, we had this really tight labor market. We were seeing wages being pushed up very high. Wages are still growing. Over the last quarter, wages were about 4.1% higher than they were in the previous year. So wages are still going up. Benefits, the value of the benefits that are being provided to employees is also increasing at about 3.5%. Now these numbers here, they have not been adjusted for inflation. I'm going to show you how that compares to inflation here in just a minute. But let's also take a quick look at how we're seeing wages change across different sectors. Over the last year, what we've basically seen is that wages in the transportation and utility sector has grown very, very quickly. They've risen by about 8%, but we're seeing growth above 3% for many of our sectors. Now recall, inflation for all items has been about 3.9%. Ideally, what we want to see is that people are becoming more productive, they're earning higher wages, and their wages are growing faster than the cost of the things that they consume. That means their purchasing power is improving. And for most of these sectors, we're seeing that, at least at the national level. There are a couple of sectors where we're quite keeping up with inflation. That's in terms of information. And wages in the construction sector haven't quite been keeping up with inflation. That may differ for Kentucky because we have seen such strong employment growth there. The construction wages may be growing faster here, or at least growing differently here than we're seeing nationally. So the tight labor market that we've seen, it's still kind of a tight labor market, but it's loosening. We are still seeing wage pressure, but that wage pressure is easing. So looking forward, what are we anticipating? Well, again, we anticipate that the higher interest rates that we've seen from the Federal Reserve are going to continue to slow the economy down. We anticipate that we're going to continue to grow, but that growth will be at a slower pace. We anticipate that inflationary pressures will continue to ease, and we will be seeing some increases in the unemployment rate for a period of time. Again, our unemployment rate tends to be relatively low. There's been a lot of discussion in the press about the Federal Reserve September meeting, speculating that there might actually be a rate reduction at that point in time. I don't know if they're going to do that or not, but it's starting to seem much more likely. But it does certainly feel like the economy is moving to a place that the Fed has been looking for. We also think that we're going to continue to grow. And while we can never completely rule out the risk of a recession seems to be a very low probability at this point. So our outlook is very positive in terms of the economy, that we will continue to grow, just maybe not at the pace that we have seen over the last year. That concludes my comments, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Very good. Thank you very much for the presentation. Good information. Anyone seeking recognition for comment or question? Senator, please.
A comment. Inflation rate is down, but the prices have not come down.
That's correct. Well, the general prices have not come down. That's correct. And it's unlikely that we will see prices come down comparable to what they were prior to the pandemic.
We'd actually have to have a deflation take place to actually cut into the absolute value of the price itself.
And that can actually cause other economic problems
Yes.
because if you start to see prices go down, what do you do as a consumer? You wait.
Yep.
And if you wait, demand goes down. Businesses don't sell their goods.
Critical mass.
Exactly.
Yep. Anyone else? Senator Frank Fromeyer?
Yeah, I really appreciate the detail that you're sharing with us. The unemployment versus those not seeking employment is often reflected as a statistical number or as a percentage. What is the real number? When you talk about the U.S. versus Kentucky, how many real people are we talking about?
So I don't have that number, but if what you're referring to is how many people would like to work, even though they may not be showing up as being categorized as unemployed, I have to look and see if we've got that number available. I don't have it with me today, but I can get that back to you.
If you do have it, please submit it to the committee so we can disseminate.
I'll send it to
all
staff.
members. Thank you.
In the Workforce Attraction and Retention Task Force, it was presented a little bit by the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and it wasn't an exact number either, but it was approximately 280,000 people. So I'm not sure if we are saying that they would like to work. They're within that age range. They're within the optimal or the prime age.
Yeah.
But we don't often talk about that number. That's a big number, and it
Yeah.
might even be closer to 500,000. But I think we need to be acknowledging there's quite a number of Kentuckians that aren't actively participating in the workforce.
Correct, and that number varies considerably throughout the economic cycle. During different points in the cycle, we have seen a large number of discouraged workers, people who would like to find work, but businesses weren't hiring. Right now, the economy has actually done fairly well, so that's probably a smaller number than what we've experienced historically. But I'll take a look and see if I can't get you something.
Thank you. Anyone else? Seeing no one, thank you very much for the presentation. I will appoint to the remainder of the agenda very quickly. Correspondence received. I would suggest for your consideration, look at it. List of reports, look at it. If you want further information or want to review the reports, just say so and someone will assist you with that. And then we have September the 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Senator McDaniel is going to bring an exhilarating committee to call, and just be ready. Hold on to your seats, and September 18th, it's coming, people. With that,